Welcome back to Missing. I am Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. We have a real treat for our listeners. We have two individuals on who are legendary in their fields. They're investigative journalists. They've been all over the world. The story that they bring to us today is one that happened 50 years ago. The anniversary of this is on November 13th, which is when most people are listening to this episode. And they have a new podcast about it, about their journey, about their investigation. Some people might have heard the name before and related it back to a movie with Meryl Streep, as myself did, and probably you. But Tim, before we get to this, there's no movie that has been made about your mood, so we got to get something here. How are you?
Oh boy, I'm doing great. Thanks a lot for asking. And yeah, we are joined by a couple of great guests. It's Mike Boettcher and Bob Sands. And these guys are legends in the industry, and they are working on a new podcast from ABC Audio. It's called Radioactive, the Karen Silkwood Mystery. And as you mentioned, this mystery has endured the test of time because this is a case from 1974 in Crescent, Oklahoma. And this mystery involves Karen's car potentially being forced off of the road.
And a lot of people have heard the name Silkwood before, and the person behind that name is Karen Silkwood, as you mentioned, and she worked at the Kerr-McGee nuclear facility, and this was a place that was poorly managed. It had horrible conditions. People were getting sick, and there was missing plutonium. So she became a whistleblower, and she was ready to take the company down on some level right before her untimely demise. And it's officially been declared as an accident. And as you'll hear in this conversation, it's sort of fallen onto the shoulders of Michael and Bob to bring some truth and justice to the story.
Well, we invite you to check out the podcast, Radioactive, the Karen Silkwood Mystery. Okay, everybody, thanks a lot for listening. Please follow us on social media at Missing CSM.
All right, everyone, we're going to break real quick for commercial, and we will be right back with Michael and Bob and the Karen Silkwood Mystery. And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Mike and Bob, welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
Doing well. Busy day, welcome to the University of Oklahoma and the Gaylord College of Journalism and Mass Communication.
And welcome to my private office in my private home with my dogs.
Two very original intros by two incredibly respected guests, and we're thrilled to have the both of you on. Thank you so much for joining us and taking the time. Can we have you introduce yourselves in a bit of background so the audience can find out a little bit about the both of you?
Yeah, let me go first, Mike, because Mike is going to have at least 10 minutes for this, okay? He's got a tremendous history. I've been in broadcast journalism now for 55 years, radio, television, mostly radio. Loved every second of it, but my whole life changed back in 1974 with Karen Silkwood's death. It led me on a path to be an investigative reporter. I've investigated everything from mafiosos to, well, I can't talk about some of them because it was while I was a private investigator. But I was a private investigator, had a lot of big cases, got to work many, many times with this character next to me, Mike Boettcher, who is an absolutely fantastic reporter and journalist with a great history. Go ahead, Mike.
Hi, I'm Mike Boettcher. Bobby and I have known each other since the 1974, right? Or 73, Bobby, right?
73.
I was a young cub radio reporter still in college back then. I left Oklahoma in 1980 to help launch a little cable startup in Atlanta that became known as CNN. And so I was one of the original correspondents for CNN. In my career, I spent 10 years as a correspondent for them, 20 for NBC News, and the last 10 years I've been working with ABC. Much of that time was conflict reporting, but the best investigative reporter I've ever worked with, and I've worked with the best, is Bob Sands. So much so that when I was at NBC and the Oklahoma City bombing occurred and I was flown in here, NBC put me in charge of the investigation of the Oklahoma City bombing. I said, well, I'll do that, but I need Bob Sands. We've been teaming up for a long time, and, we like to solve mysteries.
Can we get that on T-shirts?
Yeah.
I need Bob Sands.
I need Bob Sands. Get me Bob Sands now.
I prefer we love to solve mysteries, okay?
You two are like a Woodward and Bernstein type.
Well, it's funny because, we're from that generation, so we were heavily influenced by that. We all, those of us who grew up in journalism in the 70s wanted to be Woodward and Bernstein. And in fact, in our radio newsroom, that's what they used to nickname Bobby and me, was Woodward and Bernstein. That was meant as a joke back then, but we kind of took it seriously. So we've still been doing that, over the course of decades now. And again, Bobby's the best, and we're close friends, and, it's just a pleasure working with someone you like to work with, and that, I'm strong at some things, Bobby's stronger at other things, and we work well together. Hopefully we'll continue doing this until the Reaper comes, whenever that is.
Yeah, Mike's a great guy to work with. He really is. We've learned over the years how to play off each other, how to work together as a team. He is a superb writer. He knows how to tell a story. I know how to dig one up, and from that, it works.
So that's the dynamic. Bob digs up the stories, investigates them, passes the information off to Mike. You formulate the story that's going to go out to the public, and that's how the working relationship came together, and that's what you've been doing for so many years.
Pretty much. I do a little investigative stuff myself, but I'm not in Bobby's league on that. My job at CNN was I created and ran in 2000 the CNN Terrorism Investigation Unit. My job for a few years was tracking Al-Qaeda around the globe. I wish I would have had Bobby on that one. It would have gone a lot smoother, and I did on some of it.
Wow, very cool. Well, I feel like we're very lucky to have you both. I'm curious, how did your journeys lead you to produce for ABC Audio?
I have, a lot of respect for and the close association with ABC going back to 2009 when I was embedded for 2 years with my son in Afghanistan. I left NBC News to do this project and make a film, which became a film called The Hornet's Nest. For ABC, reported on the Afghan War and the Iraq War. And then when I came back home after 2 years, continued to work for ABC. In my older years here, I teach full-time. I don't have time to work for ABC full-time. But if I have a passion project, something I want to do, I go to ABC. We like to do documentaries. I'm a TV person. But frankly, the documentary market is not good right now. And as Bobby will tell you, what I wanted to do for years, and so did Bobby, was to go back to the case of Karen Silkwood and how she died. And when we couldn't crack the documentary market or the long-form market on this, I said, we got to, the 50th anniversary is coming up. Let's do a podcast. And ABC Audio stepped in. I called my friends at ABC, and here we are. And we're doing television stuff as well, but the centerpiece of this project is this podcast.
Yeah, and we just got an important piece of information in from OU, the library. I'll share this just real quick. Elaine is looking for those documents that they need so badly from the depository they have there on this case.
Okay. The ones that I have in my possession?
No, actually, these are the ones that were in the OU Law Library archive, the exhibits.
Yeah.
Especially that one letter that they wanted so badly. I've been going back and forth with Nancy on this, and we finally have Elaine online, and she's looking. So we should have it very soon.
Okay, thank you.
This is an ongoing investigation. We have stuff, in fact, I have a very important call I'm waiting on right now. If it comes in, I'll have to jump over here and take it. This thing is developing even as we speak.
It's not a static investigation. I mean, as we're producing this with the folks at ABC Audio in New York, new information keeps coming in. And, it's such a massive case with so many, different elements to it that, that it's going to continue this way until it airs. So it's been a busy time.
Though that's evident based on what just happened here. In real time, you just got this information, and you needed to make sure that Mike knew that you had this information because that's going to be on your list of things to do probably right after you're done this conversation. So for those who don't know the Karen Silkwood story, I think some of them know it by the movie that was made in the 80s, in the early 80s with Meryl Streep. Can you give a little bit of a background on Silkwood the person?
Bobby, go ahead.
Well, both of us have a real wealth of knowledge about Karen because we've been basically living with her now for years. She was a typical Texas girl, born and raised in Nederland, Texas. But what was really special about her was she was incredibly intelligent. She was the only girl in chemistry class in high school, and she won a scholarship to the local university because she was a straight A student, very, very bright young woman with a great future ahead of her. She wanted to be a scientist. Unfortunately, life got in the middle of that plan, and she wound up married to a guy. She had 3 kids. I say married, it was a common law marriage. He worked in an oil patch. It didn't work out. The marriage didn't work out. Things happened, and she ended up being forced to give up her kids and moving away. She came to Oklahoma, and lo and behold, she got a job at a nuclear processing facility called Kerr-McGee Plutonium processing plant near Crescent, Oklahoma, as a lab technician. And for her, that was a dream come true. She was in science. She was working with cutting edge stuff. The company's project involved making plutonium rods, plutonium uranium rods, to power the test facility in Hanford, Washington, that was designed to allow major exploration on a whole new world of nuclear reactors. From that, she was where she wanted to be.
And then she started discovering that the conditions weren't good. The people were becoming contaminated with plutonium, and that as well she was alleging, and so was the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union that she was a member of, alleging that there was more than shoddy working conditions, that the plant was also falsifying the safety reviews, the x-rays of welds when they made these rods full of plutonium pellets, that they were substandard and there were cracks in some of the welds and they were using black magic markers to put over those cracks. You got to remember, this was in the time, nuclear power was viewed as the future, but people were really concerned about it. People back then were used to growing up in the 60s with duck and cover drills from nuclear weapons. Karen, because she was probably the smartest person at that facility, wanted to do something about this. She was a young woman that everyone loved. She, with the help of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, started gathering evidence of the bad working conditions and how people were becoming contaminated with plutonium, which eventually will kill you with cancer.
Let me interject one statistic here just to make that point clear. In the 18 months that she worked there were 540 plus contamination incidents. 540.
In how long of a period of time?
18 months.
Yeah, and as she was gathering this evidence, she was actually on her way to hand over this evidence and perhaps evidence of missing plutonium from this plant, over 40 pounds worth, when she was killed in a one-car traffic accident, as the Highway Patrol called it. At that time, and still to this day, not a whole lot of people are buying that this was a one-car accident, that she, on the way to present evidence of a poorly run nuclear facility and perhaps evidence of missing plutonium from this facility, she's on her way to meet a New York Times reporter in Oklahoma City and dies in a traffic accident before she ever gets there.
And all of her documents disappeared. They were never found. Backtracking just a shred, in the weeks just before she died, she was badly contaminated, horribly contaminated, several times. Contamination showed up, plutonium showed up in her apartment. Somehow it got inside her house, inside her food, in her refrigerator. There were all kinds of allegations of surveillance, of skullduggery, being tailed. She, on more than one occasion, stopped at a friend's house to hide for the night. She was so afraid. She was being prescribed Quaaludes and other drugs to help her relax and de-stress a little. So the Highway Patrol seized on that in their analysis of this accident. She certainly must have fallen asleep at the wheel and just drove off the road and killed herself. The evidence of the accident does not substantiate that.
Can we break down what plutonium is before we go into the circumstances of the accident, and why is it so important here?
Well, it's what they make nuclear bombs with.
And power nuclear reactors. Some people call it the most dangerous substance on Earth. If you're exposed to it at high levels, you are very likely to develop cancer. All you have to do is go back and look at the scenes of the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to look at what nuclear energy can do to a human being.
And is plutonium something dangerous in the sense that it is used as a bargaining chip, currency worldwide, some sort of power play going on in there?
What is the bargaining chip or nuclear weapons? That is where the power lies, that plutonium makes hydrogen bombs. It is the critical element in that. And so, as we still know to this day, nations like Iran, like North Korea, want to get their hands on refined nuclear material like plutonium in order to build bombs. And so that's where the currency, the value lies, that someone wants to be a superpower but is a developing country. Well, the one thing that'll make you a superpower is we've got nuclear weapons.
And enriched uranium is also used for some of those processes. And Kerr-McGee also processed uranium. There was a sister plant called NUMEC. It was substantiated to have smuggled some 800 pounds of enriched uranium to Israel. So there was already a market out of America for these kinds of products to make nuclear weapons with. The Israelis got it. That meant other people in the Middle East wanted it. That's what drives North Korea to want it to this day, and also Iran.
Now, how could Karen have become contaminated by it?
Her job was to inspect the pellets themselves to make sure that they were properly formed and that they would do what they're supposed to do. And the pellets themselves are actually little small things like about that had a mix of uranium and plutonium. And the process involved nitric acid as well. And they would create these pellets in these boxes where that had gloves that you stuck your hands in, and you made these things. Her job was to make sure that they matched the quality control requirements. So she was exposed to it possibly daily. All it took was a pinprick in one of those gloves, you're exposed.
It was moving through the ventilation system. There were leaks somehow. Her allegation is the plant wasn't kept up to the standards it should be kept. And so somehow there were gaps that allowed for the leakage of this plutonium, because they're supposed to be separated behind a glass wall with those glove boxes working with this. It could come from a pinprick in one of those plastic gloves in that glass box. But in the case of Karen Silkwood, there may have been other reasons. She may have been later on, shortly before her death, intentionally contaminated. That is the allegation made by the lawyers for the Silkwood family back in their civil trial. It's alleged in books that have been written about this.
The mystery here really is who was contaminating her? How was this happening? Because there was no clear explanation for it for her. Let's backtrack just a hair. During the trial, the man who was in charge of maintenance at this plant told stories of being contaminated almost daily, every week, because he would get in there and the pipes that this material would flow through to go to where it needed to go leaked. They had leaks all over the floor. And then they would use this mixture of Tide and bleach to clean it up. And all it did was spread the plutonium all over the floor, so that the entire room became so hot nobody could even go in there. Just as a quick example, when the plant was about to show this was just after she died. The contract was running out with Hanford. There was another contract they could bid for, but Kerr-McGee was told their equipment was so archaic they would have to replace everything in the plant. Then they shut her down. But they had, farm kids working in there doing this stuff who had no idea what they were working with.
She couldn't have been the only one that was being contaminated, whether it was intentional or not. If the plant was in such a state, then everybody must have had some contamination.
Yeah, virtually everybody got contaminated at some point or another, to some degree. And to be decontaminated was a horrid process. If you ever saw the movie, you saw an example of it.
Okay, so for those who haven't seen the movie, can you explain how to decontaminate yourself?
Yeah, it's a horrid process. You get scrubbed with very heavy-duty scrubbing brushes. so much so it peels the skin off your body. You're basically stuck in a shower, butt naked, with two people on either side of you, one squirting you down with water, the other scrubbing you. And they're in moon suits. They're completely covered. And they scrub you with this incredibly harsh material to get the plutonium off your body. But that's only the exterior part. Karen breathed some in. That's why they sent her to Los Alamos to be thoroughly examined up there. And at the time, the equipment that was used had a 300% error rate. In other words, if they measured your body burden and it came out in her case at 6, that was well within AEC approved limits, they said, but give or take 300%. Holy cow. What is that worth? It's worthless. It means nothing. So, Karen was left realizing she was married to cancer, because that's what was going to happen to her. She was dying.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the circumstances of her accident?
Well, that gets very murky. She was driving on a road that she drove every day. It was a road that went right by the plant. The plant was right on the south side of the Cimarron River, and on the north side of the Cimarron River, just a few miles, about 4 or 5, was the town of Crescent. In the cafe there, the Hub Cafe, is where the union held its meetings, and that night she had a union meeting. She left the meeting with those documents to go to this rendezvous in Oklahoma City with the reporter. She got on Highway 74, which is a 2-lane road, very narrow, with very steep shoulders. And this was at 7 o'clock at night. In November, the sun had already set. She proceeded down that road, 7 miles from Crescent, barely a mile away from the plant. Her car suddenly veers from the right-hand lane, across the median, the strip, to the other lane, and then off to the shoulder of the road. So she's now driving on the left-hand side of that highway going southbound. And she drove that way for 250 feet. Now, Karen was an accomplished race car driver. She and her boyfriend, they took this little Honda Civic and they put it through slalom courses. And they did it for time. She won trophies. She was very good at it. She knew how to drive a car and how to handle a car. At the very end of that 250 feet, she starts to try to pull up back onto the road, and that's when she hit this culvert that was under the road that nobody could see. She flew over the north wing wall, over the culvert, slammed headfirst into the south wing wall, and that was the end of it. Completely crushed the car.
And how fast was she going?
She was going 55 miles an hour when she left the road. She was going about 35 miles an hour when she hit the concrete wall. And that Honda, when you have a front-end collision, it was designed for the engine to go underneath the car. So the engine was actually underneath her when it came to a rest. And she was pretty much killed instantly.
Now, the interesting thing about that accident report, the highway patrolman who investigated it, and we actually know from an eyewitness that he was told to change his investigative report of that accident several times, but that the steering wheel was bent forward, which means her elbows were locked and she was trying to control it. And when she hit that concrete wing wall to the culvert, it bent those forward. Now, that's someone who is awake and conscious, who's holding onto that steering wheel, elbows locked, and that steering wheel is bent forward. That's not someone who's fallen asleep. And that's what, the premier accident investigator of the time, A.O. Pipkin, who was hired by the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union to look into this. A.O. Pipkin, he did Jane Mansfield's accident investigation when she died. So he was the celebrity accident investigator, but he was really, really good. To him, no way that this was a single-car crash. He believed that she was forced off the road.
And then wasn't allowed to get back on the road. That's why she drove 250 feet on the shoulder, because whoever had bumped her from behind pulled over in that left lane and wouldn't let her up. Our working theory is they were trying to stop her to get the documents because the phones had all been bugged, and she had recently told a friend what she had about the missing plutonium, and they wanted those documents back. They did not want that story coming out. At the time, Kerr-McGee Corporation was probably the biggest oil and gas operation in the state of Oklahoma. There are streets downtown still named after them, Robert S. Kerr and Dean A. McGee. They controlled and owned huge operations. They were accused of cornering the uranium market back in the 60s with the help of Senator Kerr. In fact, Robert F. Kennedy came to Oklahoma twice just to make nice with Senator Kerr because he needed bills through the Senate. So, I mean, they were very, very powerful people.
Just want to revisit one comment that you made, Mike, when you said that the accident report, they asked him to change the report. The him in that, was that Pimkin?
No, they asked the highway patrolman. The highway patrolman who investigated that accident, this was his first fatality investigation. He was a rookie. This will lead us to why we are tackling this now, because there was another investigation done by another very experienced highway patrolman in the early 1990s. And he recorded everything he came up with in his investigation of the Silkwood accident and death. He kept contemporaneous audio notes. They ended up with Bobby here, and you might tell that story, Bobby. And that's why we're back onto this now, because these audio tape recordings of his investigation, his notes, were to be kept secret until certain people died.
This highway patrolman left the highway patrol. He became an investigator for the local district attorney, and a very dear friend of mine worked there as a handwriting expert. He stopped me one day in 1993. I was up at the courthouse doing some work, and he said, "Here's a tape recording you're going to be very interested in, but you can't use anything on it, and you can't share this with anybody until everybody who is mentioned here is dead." And I told him, I said, "David, that's not fair. You know, I'm a reporter. My job is to spill the beans." He said, "Well, you can't spill these beans, brother, not until they're dead." And when I listened to the recording, I understood why. And I can't get into all the details, but just suffice it to say, it's very powerful. Unfortunately, he took everything he found. He recorded everything in real time. He would do an interview. He'd get back in his patrol car. He'd record what he'd found. He took all of that to the FBI, the U.S. Justice Department, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, even back to that district attorney. Nobody would touch it because of the names of those who were allegedly involved.
This highway patrolman who had conducted that later investigation is the one back during the Silkwood accident investigation who has the eyewitness accounts that this rookie highway patrolman who investigated the accident had been told how many times, Bob?
He said 4 times. 4 times he had to change the report.
Who was telling him to redo it?
His superiors.
And at what point did it?
When it was called a one-car accident with no one else involved.
On the 4th try.
Yeah.
And we get to hear some of these tapes in the podcast?
Yep. You'll hear the tapes, and you'll hear the tapes also of a private investigator who was hired by the Silkwood family back in the late 70s to investigate what happened. We found those in a true movie setting inside a giant warehouse full of old crates stacked to the ceiling, something straight out of an Indiana Jones movie. We poured through those crates, 4 big, huge ones. The very last box and the very last crate, Mike bends down and says, "Oh my God, it says Silkwood." And inside were his reports, all of his tape-recorded interviews, all of it. And you'll hear some of those too.
And do we actually hear the moment where you guys discover this?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
In this genre, of reporting and going back on crime, true crimes or unsolved crimes, you're always looking for that smoking gun. The problem with the Silkwood case is there's a hell of a lot of smoke, and it's hard to find that, that weapon it's coming from. We've been up against that, the entire time in this case. You're going to hear new information about what happened to Karen Silkwood in the eyes of those who investigated it in real time, because we have their voices from a half century ago. It goes back to the surveillance society of the 70s when some American intelligence agencies were getting a bit out of hand in terms of surveillance. One of the things we discovered through these audio tapes was Karen Silkwood, her story was part of a much broader surveillance by the, people going back to the Nixon White House and that era who were considered enemies because they were anti-nuclear. And so you had a systematic surveillance of anti-nuclear activists, union members who worked in these plants. These people were considered enemies of nuclear power. And there was a systematic surveillance, wiretapping, bugging phones, all of that throughout the country, not just here in Oklahoma and not just at the Kerr-McGee plant. These people were being monitored closely. And that takes us back to Karen Silkwood when she was on that highway, Highway 74, headed south to Oklahoma City to hand over those documents to a New York Times reporter. How would they know she was carrying documents? Those documents disappeared. Witnesses at the cafe a few minutes before when she left said she had a notebook and a folder and documents and all of this. There was nothing there at the crash site. It was all gone. How would they know she would have been carrying this material unless they were listening to her phone calls?
And how would they know that she was going to take them to a New York Times reporter? If it had been me or Mike back then, okay, they could have brushed us off. It wouldn't have been a big deal because we were Cubs. This was the New York Times. That was a very different deal.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
And things really started to heat up because only in the latter stages of her investigation she was doing did she come across the fact that there was missing plutonium in the plant. And that's when things really started to heat up. And that's when she got suddenly a heavy dose of plutonium contamination. She talked about this in phone calls to union officials with the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union in Washington. And she told coworkers that she had proof of this that she was taking to that New York Times reporter. After those phone calls, that's when things really got bad for her. That's when her apartment became contaminated with plutonium, her refrigerator, her bathroom. And the question is and was, did she contaminate herself or did someone do it on purpose?
Yeah, we know for a fact there were two samples. When you get contaminated, you have to give fecal and urine samples to the plant. And then it goes off to their laboratory for testing, okay? Her last fecal and urine samples came back incredibly full of plutonium. It was proven in court. Somebody spiked them. Somebody put plutonium in those two samples to make it look worse than it was. And this is before her house had even been contaminated. So somebody was already messing around. Somebody was already trying to cause her difficulty. And she, as Mike said, became terribly contaminated in the last weeks of her life. After a phone call to a coworker telling him she knew 40 pounds of plutonium was missing.
What kind of accountability is there with the plutonium? She knew like a specific number. So who's keeping track of it and how do you even move it? And where would you bring it in order to, profit from it somehow?
Well, plutonium is a byproduct of a nuclear reaction. Plutonium doesn't exist, in the world. It's a byproduct of a nuclear reaction in a nuclear power plant powered by uranium. So what they did was they took plutonium, raw plutonium, from nuclear power plants. They shipped it in big barrels on trucks to the plant in Oklahoma, in Crescent, Oklahoma. They would put it into a kind of slurry in a big tank, and then they would start processing it, mixing it with the uranium that they were processing right next door. In fact, people used to walk processed uranium, walk it from the uranium plant, to the plutonium plant and stick it through a window. And they would take that and then they'd start doing stuff with it, mixing it up to make the rods. So, yeah, it had to be processed, had to be handled very, very carefully.
How would then someone steal it?
You'd have to smuggle it out, wouldn't you? Guess what? In the first days of that plant, there was no fence around it. There was no security there. One of the stories that we were told is that elementary school students took uranium pellets to school for show and tell. Yes.
How?
Dad gave it to him.
You just hold them in your hands?
Yeah. There were pellets scattered all around that uranium plant. That was another major investigation. How did that happen? The plant said, well, it was workers who were just trying to embarrass the company. It was so sloppy that uranium pellets could just wind up here or there. There was no fencing. There were no guards until the AEC finally made them hire some guards and put up a fence. So in the first years of its operation, anybody could have walked in there and made an arrangement with the worker. Hey, I need some plutonium. Can you get me some? Well, sure. And they would have just put it in something and brought it out to him.
I'm just curious, do you guys have a theory, or were you able to prove who took those files from Karen's car?
We have a theory.
We have a working theory, but it is based on evidence.
That there was a car that forced her off the road. They wanted to get those documents and not kill her. They wanted the car to stop or to scare her. Karen, being the good driver she was, wasn't about to stop. The accident investigation by A.O. Pipkin shows that her left rear bumper was struck by another vehicle, which caused the car to tail end, to swerve to the right, and the car to move forward across the left lane to the side of the highway where she was trying to keep control of it and was trying to get back on the road at some point, trying to evade this second car, when the concrete culvert came that she smashed into. And it was dark and she didn't see it. After that, who knows? Her co-workers and union members that she met with before she took that fateful trip to Oklahoma City, 30 miles away, to meet the New York Times reporter, they said they witnessed her with these files and her notebook full of notes and documents, but those documents were never found. If you believe the people at the Hub Cafe who worked with Karen Silkwood and who were part of the union, when she was there dying or dead, someone, and it was the people who forced her off the road, went down and grabbed the documents, and they've never been recovered. Ever.
This has been 50 years. Is there any sense of danger for the two of you? Because there's still what appears to be cover-ups and a lot of dangerous motivations. I know that the Kerr-McGee Corporation doesn't exist anymore, but is there still some sort of unease as you're going into this? That do you look in your rearview mirror? How close are you getting to some truths here?
Look, we've been tracking down a lot of people who are still alive, the ones still surviving, and most of these people are in their 70s or 80s, like Bobby and me, and getting people to talk a half century later has been difficult. It's taken a lot of work because they are afraid. A lot of people who were looking into this case or were talking about this case or had some involvement with it have died over the years. 50 years later, hey, look, I'm an Okie. I'm from this state. I know how to navigate this place. And no, I don't worry about that. But I think what people are worried about is that this missing plutonium was part of a bigger secret, ultra-secret government program to divert uranium and plutonium to allies like Israel who were trying to build a nuclear weapon. Or already had a weapon and were trying to build more. There may have been other countries as well. I think what people are more worried about is the man, in quotes, so to speak, spy agencies. And look, I was a national security correspondent for a long time. I worked around folks from the CIA and the NSA and all of that. I covered them. When I was investigating Al-Qaeda, I utilized those folks. They do great stuff. But back in those days, in the 70s, those intelligence agencies were tasked to do some dirty, wet jobs. These are secret, wet jobs, I mean bloody jobs. And these are secrets that still remain buried and are awfully, awfully hard to get to. If you want to know how confusing this can be and the smoke that's out there and how you get lost in it, there is a Netflix documentary I highly recommend, The American Conspiracy, The Octopus Murders. They spent multiple parts in that series, and at the end of it are saying, we don't know what happened. If you start going down these roads that there's some massive government conspiracy to keep a super secret plutonium and uranium smuggling operation to our allies secret still a half century later, if you go down that road, some people look at you like you're a nut. I'm not a nut. I've been in this business a long time. I'd like to think I'm a respected journalist, and I've worked at the highest level for a long, long time in very dangerous places all around the world. And on this one, let me tell you, folks, I'm not a nut. I know what I'm doing, and something really stinks here. And that's why we're doing this.
Thank you so much, Mike and Bob, for joining us here today. Radioactive, the Karen Silkwood mystery, begins airing on November 12th, 2024. So we're definitely going to be there listening. This is a crazy story I can't wait to learn more about.
We're excited that ABC Audio gave us a chance to tell this story because, not many people are left out there that want to tell what happened. And Karen Silkwood deserves justice. Her surviving children deserve to know. And they want to know, and we've been working with them.
So how many episodes are scheduled to be released?
Right now, 4. We're fighting for more. There's a lot to cram in there. And, the thing is, this is an ongoing, it's not one of those things where it's a true crime. It was in court and this is what happened. A lot of stuff is happening as we speak. We're learning new things. So there's something that could be pivotal to this that we're going to be uncovering here in the next few days. We know exists and we know where it's at, and we're going there to get that evidence, and it could speak the truth. This item could speak the truth about what happened to Karen Silkwood on that dark, lonely road back in November of 1974.